The first gunshot cracked across Devil's Canyon like a whip-splitting bone. Ada Carrick threw herself over her son as the second bullet splintered the wagon wheel beside them, sending wood shards flying like angry wasps. Blood already stained Eli's torn shirt where Roy's fist had found its mark an hour before. But now, her 10-year-old boy gripped a jagged piece of wagon board, his knuckles white as winter frost. "Give me the boy, Ada." Roy Whitmore's voice boomed across the frozen Colorado plains, his breath forming clouds in the bitter December air. Whitmore blood belongs with Whitmore kin. Ada's heart hammered against her ribs as she peered over the wagon's edge. Roy sat astride his black stallion 30 yards away. Winchester raised his weather-beaten face, twisted with the same rage that had driven her from his ranch 3 days ago. Behind him, 2 other riders waited in the pale dawn light, men she didn't recognize, but their hands rested easy on their gun butts. "I'd rather die than go back to you." Eli's voice cracked with the effort of sounding brave, but Ada heard the tremor underneath. The boy had his father's stubborn jaw, but Thomas had never faced down armed men with nothing but splinters and fury. A shadow moved on the ridge above them. Ada caught it from the corner of her eye, a lone figure with a bow watching, waiting. The silhouette vanished before she could focus on it, leaving her wondering if desperation had conjured phantoms in the early light. On the last chance, Roy spurred his horse closer, the Winchester never wavering. "You can climb down peaceful-like, or I can drag you both back in pieces. Makes no difference to me." The third shot punched through the wagon bed, missing Eli's head by inches. Ada's world narrowed to the space between heartbeats, between breaths, between the choice to surrender or fight, with nothing but her bare hands against 3 armed men who saw her as less than human. That's when the arrow found Roy's shoulder. 3 months earlier, Ada had been a different woman. Soft-spoken church-going content to tend her small garden behind the cabin Thomas built with his own hands. She'd believed in goodness then, in the kindness of family, in the protection that marriage and motherhood were supposed to provide. Thomas Carrick had been a gentleman, too gentle for the harsh realities of frontier life, Roy often said. When consumption took him that October, Ada thought grief would be her greatest enemy. She was wrong. Can't have a woman and boy living alone on Whitmore land. Roy had declared the day after the funeral, standing in her doorway like judgment itself. "Family takes care of family, Ada. You'll move into the main house, help with the cooking and cleaning, earn your keep." Ada had tried to explain that Thomas had legally deeded the cabin to her, that she had $17 saved and plans to take in sewing. Roy's laughter had been cold as a January wind. "Papers don't mean much out here, sister-in-law. What matters is who's got the guns and the men to back them up." The first beating came when she refused to hand over her wedding ring. Thomas's grandmother's ring, the only thing of value she owned. Roy said it was wasteful for a widow to wear such finery. The second came when Eli spoke back to Roy's hired hand, a weasel-faced man named Decker who enjoyed frightening children. "Boy needs to learn respect," Roy had said after striking Ada for interfering. "And you need to learn your place." By November, Ada's place had become clear. She was a servant in all but name working from dawn to dark, while Roy drank away the ranch's profits and entertained thoughts that made her skin crawl. The way he looked at her across the dinner table. The way he'd find excuses to brush against her in the narrow hallway. The way he spoke of Thomas as if her dead husband had been a fool for treating her with kindness. "Thomas always was soft on you." Roy would say his words slurred with whiskey. "Maybe it's time someone showed you how a real man handles his woman." Ada learned to sleep with her door barred and Eli's cot pushed against it. She learned to move quiet as smoke through the house, to keep her eyes down, to make herself small and unremarkable. But she also learned that Roy's cruelty had limits. He needed her to cook and clean, needed the appearance of propriety that a sister-in-law provided. As long as she was useful, she was safe. Until the night she caught Roy in Eli's room. The boy was crying. Not the loud, angry tears of a child's tantrum, but the silent, desperate weeping of someone trying not to make a sound. Roy knelt beside the cot, one hand over Eli's mouth and the other fumbling with his belt buckle. "Hush now, boy. This is what men do. What your daddy should have taught you." Ada moved without thinking, grabbing the poker from the fireplace and bringing it down across Roy's skull with all the strength in her body. The iron rang like a bell against bone, and Roy toppled sideways, blood streaming from his scalp. She thought she'd killed him. For a moment, as Roy lay motionless in the lamplight, Ada felt nothing but fierce satisfaction. Then his chest rose and fell, and she knew they had minutes at most before he woke up and killed them both. "Mama." Eli's voice was small and broken. "Get dressed." Ada said, her voice steady despite the earthquake in her hands. "We're leaving, right now." They'd taken nothing but the clothes on their backs, Ada's hidden $17, and Thomas's old mule and wagon. 3 days of hard travel through increasingly wild country had brought them to Devil's Canyon, where Roy had finally caught up with them. Now, as the Comanche arrow jutted from Roy's shoulder and his horse reared in panic, Ada realized their ordeal was far from over. It was just beginning. "Son of a bitch!" Roy roared, fighting to control his panicked mount while blood soaked his shirt. His two companions wheeled their horses, searching the ridgeline for the archer, but found only empty rock and bitter wind. A voice called out in heavily accented English, "3 guns against woman and child. Where is honor in this?" The speaker emerged from behind a cluster of boulders, a Comanche warrior, bow in hand, arrow nocked and ready. Ada's blood turned to ice water. Stories of Comanche raids filled every newspaper, every traveler's tale. They were supposed to be ruthless killers, scalp hunters, child stealers. This man looked nothing like the savages from dime novels. Tall and lean, with intelligent dark eyes and graying hair braided with leather cords, he moved with the careful grace of someone accustomed to violence, but not eager for it. His buckskin clothing was well-made, practical rather than decorative, and his weathered face held more weariness than cruelty. "Ada and Tamaqua." Roy spat, yanking the arrow from his shoulder with a grunt of pain. "Should have known you'd stick your nose where it don't belong." The familiarity in Roy's voice surprised Ada. These two knew each other. "You know this man." She called out, her voice hoarse from cold and fear. "Know him." Roy laughed bitterly. "This red bastard's been stealing cattle from honest ranchers for years. Living proof that the only good Indian is a dead Indian." Tamaqua's expression didn't change, but his bow drew back another inch. "I take only what is fair payment for land stolen from my people. You know this, Roy Whitmore. Fair payment, my ass. You're nothing but a common thief." Roy's companions had positioned themselves to flank the Comanche, but Tamaqua seemed unconcerned. "And you're harboring criminals. This woman stole money from me and corrupted my nephew. There's a warrant for her arrest." "I stole nothing." Ada found her voice. "And I'm protecting my son from family discipline, from Christian guidance." Roy's bleeding had slowed, but his face remained pale with pain and rage. "Boy needs a firm hand, not a mother's coddling." Tamaqua studied them all with those dark, thoughtful eyes. Whatever he saw in Ada's face, in Eli's terrified expression, in Roy's barely contained violence, it seemed to decide him. "Woman," he said quietly. "You run from this man." "Yes." Ada's voice was barely a whisper. "He hurt your child." Ada's throat closed up entirely. She could only nod. Tamaqua's second arrow took Roy's horse in the chest. The animal screamed and went down, pinning Roy's wounded leg beneath its thrashing body. The other 2 riders cursed and reached for their guns, but found themselves staring down the barrel of a rifle that had appeared in Tamaqua's hands, as if by magic. "You have choice," Tamaqua said calmly. "Ride away now, or stay and die with your friend." The men looked at Roy, trapped and bleeding beneath his dead horse, then at the rifle pointed at their chests. Cowardice won out over loyalty. "This ain't over," one of them shouted as they spurred their mounts away. "There's a bounty on that woman now. Every lawman and bounty hunter between here and California will be looking for her." Their hoofbeats faded into the distance, leaving only the wind and Roy's labored breathing. Tamaqua approached the fallen man rifle, still ready. "You will not follow them again," he said simply. "Go to hell," Roy gasped. "You just signed your own death warrant, Redskin, and theirs too." Tamaqua considered this for a moment, then raised his rifle. Ada thought he meant to kill Roy outright, but instead he fired a shot into the air. The sound echoed off the canyon walls like thunder. "Then wolves will come soon," Tamaqua said. "Maybe you live long enough for rescue, maybe not." He turned to Ada and Eli, who had emerged from behind their broken wagon. "You cannot travel in open country now. Too many hunters will seek bounty on your heads. What do you want from us?" Ada asked, her voice steady despite her fear. "Nothing. But winter comes hard and early this year. You will die without shelter and food." Tamaqua shouldered his rifle. "I offer both. No cost." Ada looked at Eli, saw the exhaustion and pain in his young face, felt the bite of the wind that promised snow before nightfall. She thought of Roy's warning about bounty hunters, about the impossibility of reaching any town where they might find help. "Why would you help us?" Tamaqua was quiet for so long that Ada thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief. "I had a daughter once, and a son. White soldiers killed them for sport while I was away hunting." He met her eyes. "Some debts can never be repaid. But sometimes we can try." Tamaqua's camp lay hidden in a box canyon 2 miles north of Devil's Canyon, accessed by a narrow trail that wound between towering red walls. Ada had never seen a more defensible position. One man with a rifle could hold off an army from the canyon mouth. The camp itself was modest, a sturdy wickiup made of bent saplings and buffalo hide, a stone fire ring, and a small corral where 3 horses grazed on hay, stored in skin containers. A clear stream ran through the center of the canyon, its banks thick with cottonwoods that provided both shelter and fuel. "You live here alone?" Ada asked as Tamaqua helped them down from his pack horse. "My band is scattered. Some dead, some fled to reservation. I stay because this place has power." He gestured toward the canyon walls where Ada could now see faded red paintings of buffalo eagles and human figures. "My grandfather's grandfather drew those. This is sacred ground." Eli stared at the cave paintings with wonder, momentarily forgetting his fear. How old are they? Old as the buffalo herds before white men came. Tamaqua's voice held neither anger nor accusation, just statement of fact. "Your people and mine have different ways of marking time." The wickiup was larger inside than it appeared from without, and surprisingly warm. Thick buffalo robes covered the floor, and smoke holes in the hide walls drew fresh air without creating drafts. Tamaqua set about preparing food while Ada tended to Eli's injuries, bruises from Roy's fists, scratches from their desperate flight through thorny undergrowth. "Will the man Roy live?" Eli asked quietly as Ada cleaned a cut on his forehead. "I don't know, honey. I hope so." Ada was surprised to find she meant it. Despite everything Roy had done, she didn't want his death on her conscience. "You should not hope for his life," Tamaqua said from where he knelt by the fire stirring a pot of stew. "He will bring others, many others. Your mercy may cost lives." "Then what should I have done? Let him—" Ada stopped glancing at Eli. "Let him hurt me." Eli finished. "Mama, I know what he was going to do. I'm not a baby." The matter-of-fact way her son spoke of such horror made Ada's chest tight with rage and sorrow. No child should have to carry such knowledge. "You did what any mother would do," Tamaqua said quietly. But now you must be more than mother. You must be warrior." That night, as wind howled through the canyon and snow began to fall, Ada lay awake, listening to Eli's breathing and wondering what kind of warrior she could possibly become. She'd been raised to be soft, compliant, dependent on men for protection and provision. Now she was alone in the wilderness, with her child relying on the kindness of a stranger who belonged to a people she'd been taught to fear. But as she drifted towards sleep, Ada realized something had changed in her. The woman who'd endured Roy's abuse in silence was gone, left behind in Devil's Canyon, with the broken wagon and the pool of blood in the snow. What remained was harder, sharper, forged in the fire of necessity, and tempered by the absolute certainty that she would do anything, become anything, to protect her son. The first week passed in a haze of survival lessons. Tamaqua taught Ada to track game by their prints in the snow, to read weather signs in the color of the sky, and the behavior of birds to preserve meat by smoking it over carefully tended fires. Eli learned to use a bow, his thin arms gradually gaining strength as he practiced shooting at targets carved from pine bark. "Your boy has good eyes," Tamaqua observed on the fourth day, watching Eli split a piece of bark at 20 paces. "And steady hands. He will be fine, Hunter." His father was like that. Ada said, surprised by how easily the words came. She rarely spoke of Thomas anymore. The memories were too raw, too tangled with grief and regret. Could hit a prairie dog at 100 yards with his old rifle. "Good man, your husband?" "The best." Ada's voice caught slightly. Too good for this world, maybe. He believed people were basically decent, that kindness would be returned with kindness. Even Roy at first. Thomas thought his brother just needed time to adjust to having family around. "And you? What did you believe?" Ada considered the question as she watched Eli knock another arrow. "I believed in Thomas, in his goodness. I thought if I was quiet enough, helpful enough, grateful enough, everyone would leave us alone." She laughed bitterly. Turned out quiet women make easy targets. Tamaqua was silent for a long moment, whittling a new arrow's shaft with practiced strokes of his knife. "My wife was not quiet woman. Ayana, it means eternal blossom in my language. She had voice like summer thunder when angry, laugh like water over stones when happy. Never afraid to speak her mind, even to warriors twice her size. What happened to her? Cavalry patrol found our winter camp 3 years ago. Said they were looking for stolen horses. Tamaqua's knife movements became more precise, more controlled. Ayana told them no horses were stolen, that they were not welcome on sacred ground. Captain said she was insolent and needed to learn respect for white authority." Ada felt ice forming in her stomach. "Tamaqua, you don't have to." "They shot her in front of our children. My son Little Wolf tried to protect his mother with child's bow. They shot him too." The knife stopped moving. "My daughter's singing bird was only 6 winters. They said she would be better raised by Christian family. Dear God, I came back to find graves and empty lodge. Tracker told me soldiers took Singing Bird to reservation school in Kansas." Tamaqua sheathed his knife and stood. "I went to Kansas. Found school, found my daughter." Ada waited, afraid to breathe. She did not know me. They had cut her hair, dressed her in white girl's clothes, taught her to be ashamed of her father's blood. Tamaqua's voice remained steady, but Ada could see the pain in his eyes. When I spoke to her in our language, she turned away. Said she was Sarah, now not Singing Bird. Said Indians were dirty, godless people. That's why you live alone. That is why I take cattle from men like Roy Whitmore. That is why I help women who run from such men." He looked at her directly. "Some wounds cannot heal, but they can teach us to prevent others." That night, Ada dreamed of her own daughter, the baby she'd miscarried 2 years before Eli was born. In the dream, The little girl had Tamaqua's dark eyes and her own stubborn chin, and she was teaching Eli to braid warriors' knots while singing a lullaby in a language Ada didn't recognize, but somehow understood. She woke to find Tamaqua adding wood to the fire, his movements careful and quiet in the pre-dawn darkness. "Couldn't sleep either," she whispered. "Old habits. In Comanche camps, someone always tends fire through night." He settled back against his saddle rifle across his knees. "Also, I heard horses. Far away, but coming closer." Ada's blood chilled. Roy, maybe. Or bounty hunters. Or just travelers seeking shelter. Tamaqua's tone suggested he didn't believe the last option. "We will know by sunrise." Sunrise brought the sound of many horses and shouting voices echoing off the canyon walls. Ada crept to the canyon mouth with Tamaqua, leaving Eli hidden in the wickiup, with instructions to stay silent no matter what he heard. 8 men sat their horses at the canyon entrance, breath steaming in the cold air. Ada recognized 2 of them, Roy's companions from the previous week. The others wore the badges of territorial marshals, their rifles held ready for trouble. "We know you're in there," one of the marshals called out. "Ada Carrick, you're under arrest for assault with intent to kill and theft of property. Come out peaceful-like, and nobody gets hurt." "Roy's alive." Ada whispered, relief and fear warring in her chest. "Yes, and he has told many lies." Tamaqua checked his rifle's load. "They will not believe truth over white man's word." "We also want the Indian," another voice shouted. "Tamaqua of the Comanche. There's a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of cattle theft and assault on federal officers." Tamaqua smiled grimly. "It seems we both have prices on our heads now. You got 1 minute to come out," the marshal yelled. "After that, we're coming in shooting." Ada looked back toward the wickiup where Eli waited then, at the narrow canyon mouth where 8 armed men prepared to charge. The mathematics of survival were simple and brutal. There was no way out, unless they went up instead of down. "The canyon walls," she said suddenly. "Can they be climbed?" Tamaqua followed her gaze to the red stone cliffs that enclosed them. "Yes, but it is dangerous. Many handholds are false. One mistake means death, but possible. For experienced climber, yes. For woman and child." He shrugged. Better to die trying than live as prisoners. The minute was up. With whoops and gunshots, the posse charged into the canyon. The climb began at the back of the canyon, where wind and water had carved a series of ledges and cracks in the stone. Tamaqua went first, testing each handhold, calling down warnings about loose rock and treacherous footing. Ada followed with Eli between her and the Comanche, trying not to look at the growing drop beneath them. Gunshots echoed from below as the posse searched the empty wickiup. Angry voices carried clearly in the thin air they'd found signs of recent habitation, but no fugitives. "Where the hell are they? I'll check every hiding spot behind rocks in the stream bed everywhere. Maybe they got out somehow. Not where there's only one way in or out of this canyon." Ada pressed herself against the cold stone, fighting vertigo, as a pebble knocked loose by her boot clattered down the cliff face. 50 feet below, one of the marshals looked up, scanning the walls with sharp eyes. "Hold still," Tamaqua whispered from above. "Do not move even to breathe." The marshal stared directly at them for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Ada could feel Eli trembling against her back, could hear her own heartbeat so loud she was certain it would give them away. Finally, the man looked elsewhere, dismissing the cliff face as empty shadow and stone. They climbed for another 20 minutes, muscles screaming with effort, fingertips raw and bleeding from gripping sharp rock. Just when Ada thought she couldn't pull herself up another inch, Tamaqua's hand reached down to haul her over the canyon rim. The view from the top was breathtaking, endless miles of snow-covered plains stretching to the horizon, broken by mesas and dry creek beds that would provide cover for travelers who knew how to use them. But Ada had no time to appreciate the scenery. Below them, the posse was beginning to spread out, some men checking the stream bed, while others examined the cave paintings for hidden passages. "They will find climbing route eventually," Tamaqua said quietly. "We must be far from here before then." They retrieved their horses from a hidden corral half a mile away, 3 sturdy Indian ponies that could survive on sparse grass and melted snow. Tamaqua had prepared for this possibility, keeping travel packs ready with food ammunition and winter clothing. "And where can we go?" Ada asked as they rode away from the canyon, the shouts of the posse fading behind them. "North, into Cheyenne territory, and then beyond, to Montana or Canada." Tamaqua studied the sky, where dark clouds promised more snow. "Long journey. Dangerous. Many hostile tribes, white settlements that shoot strangers on sight. But possible. With luck and skill, yes." He looked at Eli, who sat his horse with growing confidence despite his exhaustion. "Boy learns fast. He may survive what comes." Ada heard the doubt in his voice regarding her own chances, but she was past caring about the odds. She'd already survived more than she'd thought possible. If death came for them on the trail, at least it would find them free. They rode hard for 3 days, following game trails and dry creek beds, avoiding settlements and main roads. The weather grew steadily worse, first snow, then sleet, then a howling blizzard that forced them to shelter in a cave, while wind that could strip flesh from bone raged outside. On the 4th day, they made a mistake, desperate for supplies and warmer clothing. And they approached a trading post at the confluence of 2 rivers. The place looked deserted, shutters drawn, no smoke from the chimney horses corralled, but not tended. It felt like a trap, but Eli was developing a cough that worsened each night, and Ada knew they needed medicine or warm shelter soon. "Something's wrong here," Tamaqua muttered as they studied the post from a hill overlooking the valley. No trader would leave stock unguarded in this weather. "Maybe they're sick," Ada suggested, "or dead, or hiding." Before any of them could suggest an alternative, Eli's horse whinnied loudly, answering a call from the corralled animals below. The sound echoed across the valley like a bell, announcing their presence to anyone within miles. That's when the shooting started. Rifle fire erupted from the trading post windows, not the wild shooting of frightened settlers, but the disciplined volleys of trained marksmen. Bullets whined past Ada's head as she fought to control her panicked horse. Tamaqua returned fire with smooth precision, but they were exposed on the hillside with nowhere to take cover. "Ride," he shouted. "Back to the trees." They galloped toward the tree line, with bullets kicking up snow around their horses' hooves. Ada leaned low over her mount's neck, one arm wrapped around Eli to keep him in the saddle. Behind them, men were emerging from the trading post, not settlers or trappers, but professional manhunters in heavy coats and cavalry boots. Bounty hunters. Roy had put a price on their heads high enough to bring professionals into the field. They reached the trees just as Ada's horse stumbled a bullet, finding its mark in the animal's shoulder. The pony went down hard, throwing both riders into a snowbank. Ada rolled, gasping, and found Eli beside her, shaken but alive. Tamaqua wheeled his horse around, rifle ready. "Can you walk?" "Yes." Ada struggled to her feet, helping Eli stand. Her horse was thrashing in the snow blood, steaming in the cold air. There was nothing to be done for the poor animal. "Take my horse, ride north, do not stop." "What about you?" "I will slow them down." Tamaqua's face was grim with resolve. "Give you time to escape." "We're not leaving you." Eli's voice was fierce despite his chattering teeth. The bounty hunters were approaching through the trees, moving with professional caution. Ada could see at least 4 of them, probably more. Even if Tamaqua could delay them, it would likely cost him his life. "There has to be another way," she said desperately. Tamaqua looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his dark eyes. Then he made a decision that changed everything. "Yes," he said quietly. "Perhaps there is." Instead of making a doomed last stand, Tamaqua led them deeper into the forest, following what seemed like random deer trails, but was actually a carefully planned route. Ada didn't understand his strategy until they emerged from the trees near a frozen creek where smoke rose from a hidden camp. 20 Comanche warriors looked up from their fires as Tamaqua approached their hands, moving to weapons before they recognized him. The leader, a man with iron-gray hair and ritual scars across his cheeks, stood slowly, his face unreadable. "Tamaqua," he said in English for Ada's benefit. "It has been long time." "Too long, Burning Wolf." Tamaqua dismounted, his posture respectful but not submissive. "I ask sanctuary for these two, the woman and her son." Burning Wolf studied Ada and Eli with sharp eyes. "White woman, white child, why should we care what happens to them?" "Because they are hunted by the same men who killed your nephew last summer. Roy Whitmore's men." The temperature in the camp seemed to drop several degrees. Burning Wolf's expression hardened, and several of the younger warriors muttered angrily among themselves. "Oh, Roy Whitmore is dead," Burning Wolf said finally. "Killed by wolves after horse fell on him." Ada felt the blood drain from her face. Roy was dead. Whatever else happened, at least Eli would never have to fear his uncle again. "Then his bounty hunters pursue them for reward money," Tamaqua replied. Woman protected her child from Roy's appetites. Now, white law calls her criminal. Understanding flickered in Burning Wolf's eyes. In Comanche culture, a mother's right to protect her child was absolute and sacred. "How many hunt them?" "At least 6. Maybe more. Professional killers with good weapons." Burning Wolf was quiet for a long moment, weighing the risks of helping fugitives against the chance to strike back at Roy Whitmore's people. When he spoke again, his voice carried the authority of a war chief. "We will not fight your battles for you, Tamaqua. But we will not interfere if you choose to fight them yourself." He looked directly at Ada. "Woman, you have courage to run so far with child. This is good, but running ends now. You must choose fight or die." "I don't know how to fight," Ada said honestly. "You learn to climb cliffs. You learn to track game. You can learn to kill enemies." Burning Wolf gestured to one of his warriors, who brought a rifle and handed it to Ada. "Question is not whether you can learn. Question is whether you will." The rifle was heavier than she'd expected, its metal cold even through her gloves. Ada had never fired a gun in her life. Thomas had always handled the hunting, and Roy had made sure she stayed far from any weapons. "They're coming," one of the sentries called softly. 6 riders following tracks. Burning Wolf's warriors melted into the trees, with practiced silence, taking positions around the camp's perimeter. Within seconds, the clearing looked empty, except for Ada, Eli, and Tamaqua. "Oh, Mama." Eli's voice was small and frightened. "Stay behind that log," Ada whispered, pointing to a fallen pine at the edge of the clearing. "No matter what happens, don't move until I tell you." The bounty hunters rode into the clearing like harbingers of death. 6 hard-faced men with professional weapons and the confident air of people accustomed to violence. Their leader, a man with a graying beard and pale scars across his knuckles, surveyed the camp with calculating eyes. "Ada Carrick." He called out, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "My name is Jackson Reeves. I represent certain parties interested in your return to Colorado Territory. Roy Whitmore is dead." Ada replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "What use is a dead man's bounty?" Reeves smiled coldly. "Roy's death doesn't change the charges against you, ma'am. Assault, theft, corrupting a minor. Plus, now we can add murder to the list. Murder. Roy Whitmore died from injuries received during your attack on him. Makes you a killer in the eyes of the law." Reeves shifted in his saddle, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. "Of course, the boy's young enough that a good lawyer could get him placed with a Christian family. Might even find one willing to adopt him legal-like. The threat was clear surrender, or Eli would be orphaned and placed with strangers. Ada felt rage building in her chest, hot and clean and stronger than fear. And if I refuse, then we take you back dead and the boy alive. Either way works for our employers. Who are your employers? Tamaqua asked quietly. Reeves looked at the Comanche with open contempt. None of your concern, Redskin. Though there's paper on you too. Federal marshals want to stretch your neck for cattle rustling and killing white men. I've ended lives before, Tamaqua said quietly. Lives that needed to end. Just like yours. Reeves laughed. Big talk from one savage with a rifle. There's 6 of us, boy. You do the arithmetic. I count 21, Tamaqua replied. Reeves's laughter died as he realized what that meant. His eyes swept the tree line, suddenly seeing the shadows and shapes he'd dismissed as natural cover. His men were reaching for their weapons when Burning Wolf's voice rang out from the forest. You are surrounded. Drop guns and live. Keep guns and die. For a moment, Ada thought the bounty hunters might surrender. Then Reeves snarled and went for his pistol, and everything went to hell. The gunfire was deafening in the confined space of the clearing. Ada threw herself flat as bullets whined overhead, and the rifle clutched in her hands like a talisman. Through the chaos, she could see muzzle flashes from the trees as Burning Wolf's warriors poured fire into the bounty hunters. But Reeves's men were professionals, not easily panicked. They dismounted and took cover behind their horses, returning disciplined volleys that forced the Comanche to keep their heads down. One of the warriors cried out as a bullet found its mark, his rifle clattering to the ground. Ada, Tamaqua shouted from behind a fallen log 20 yards away. Use the rifle, they cannot reload while dodging bullets. Ada looked at the weapon in her hands, its mechanism foreign and terrifying. She'd never hurt another human being in her life. Even striking Roy with the poker had been an act of desperation, not deliberate violence. Then she saw Reeves drawing a bead on Eli's hiding place, his pistol steady despite the chaos around him. The rifle bucked against Ada's shoulder with shocking force, the sound of the shot lost in the general mayhem. Her bullet took Reeves in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him face first into the snow. Ada stared at what she'd done, feeling nothing but cold satisfaction. The fight continued for another minute before the surviving bounty hunters broke and ran, leaving 3 dead behind. Burning Wolf's warriors emerged from the trees, checking the bodies and gathering dropped weapons. 2 of the Comanche had been wounded, but neither seriously. It is finished, Burning Wolf announced, nudging Reeves's corpse with his boot. These men will hunt no more. Ada dropped the rifle and ran to Eli, pulling him into her arms. The boy was shaking, but unhurt, his eyes wide with shock at the violence he'd witnessed. Is it over, Mama? He whispered. I don't know, baby, I hope so. Tamaqua approached them, his face grim. 3 men escaped. They will bring others. How many others? As many as bounty will pay for. He looked at the dead bounty hunters, then at Ada. You cannot run forever. Eventually, you must make stand. Burning Wolf joined them, his scarred face thoughtful. Woman fights well for beginner. Killed leader cleanly. He studied Ada with new respect. Maybe you survive what comes after all. What comes next? Ada asked. Truth. Burning Wolf replied cryptically. Truth about Roy Whitmore and why so many want you dead. Ada felt ice forming in her stomach. What do you mean? Simple bounty does not pay for so many professional hunters. Someone wants you badly, not for justice, but for silence. Burning Wolf kicked at the snow, uncovering a leather satchel that had fallen from Reeves's horse. Maybe answers are here. The satchel contained maps, wanted posters, and a thick stack of correspondence. Ada's hands shook as she read letter after letter, each one revealing another piece of a conspiracy that went far beyond Roy's personal cruelty. Roy Whitmore hadn't been just a failed rancher and a brute. He'd been the front man for a land-grabbing scheme that involved territorial politicians, federal marshals, and Eastern Railroad interests. The plan was simple use, trumped-up charges, and manufactured emergencies to drive small ranchers and homesteaders off their property. Then buy the land for pennies on the dollar, when the owners were desperate to sell. Ada's property, the small cabin and 20 acres that Thomas had legally deeded to her, sat directly in the path of a proposed railroad spur that would be worth millions to the right investors. Roy's abuse hadn't been just personal sadism. It had been a calculated effort to force her off land that someone else wanted very badly. "They killed my husband," Ada whispered, the pieces finally falling into place. "Thomas didn't die of consumption. They poisoned him." The final letter in the stack confirmed her suspicions, a note from someone signed only as the Colonel, outlining plans to eliminate the Carrick problem permanently. Roy's death had been an inconvenience, but not a disaster. Ada and Eli still needed to die to prevent them from ever returning to claim their legal inheritance. "Now you know why they hunt you so hard," Tamaqua said quietly. "Not for justice, for money, for land, for power." Ada looked at Eli, who was reading over her shoulder with the frightening intelligence of a child forced to grow up too quickly. Her son's eyes were dark with understanding and something else, a cold anger that reminded her of Thomas in his rare moments of fury. "What do we do?" she asked. Burning Wolf smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "We go to war." The War Council convened that night around a fire built in a hidden canyon, miles from the battle site. Maps spread across buffalo robes showed the locations of ranches, settlements, and military posts throughout the territory. Burning Wolf's warriors contributed intelligence about patrol routes and supply lines, while Tamaqua added his knowledge of sympathetic traders and safe houses. Ada studied the correspondence they'd taken from Reeves, cross-referencing names and locations with the maps. A pattern emerged, a network of corruption that reached from local sheriff's offices all the way to territorial government in Denver. The colonel appeared to be Colonel Marcus Hartwell, territorial administrator for railroad development. His letters revealed a man obsessed with profit and utterly ruthless in pursuit of it. The poisoning of Thomas Carrick had been just one small step in a larger plan to clear Indian and settler claims from a 100-mile corridor of prime railroad land. "He's done this before," Ada said, pointing to references in several letters. "The Weatherby family last year officially died in a Cheyenne raid, but the dates don't match any known war parties. The Morrison Ranch supposed accident with spooked cattle, but the timing's too convenient." "Dozens of families," Tamaqua observed grimly. "All cleared from railroad path, all dead or driven away." Burning Wolf leaned forward, firelight flickering across his scarred features. "This colonel uses our people as cover for his crimes. Blames Comanche, Cheyenne, Apache for murders his men commit, which gives the army excuse to retaliate against innocent tribes," Ada realized. "He's playing everyone against each other while he steals the land. No question is, what can we do about it?" one of the younger warriors asked. "Man has soldiers, marshals, politicians in his pocket. We are few. We are few, but we know truth," Burning Wolf replied. "And we have something he wants the woman and her son." Ada felt cold fingers walking up her spine. "You want to use us as bait? I want to end this war before more innocents die." Burning Wolf met her eyes steadily. "Your choice, woman. Run forever and live as hunted animals, or stand and fight for justice." Ada looked at Eli, who had been listening to the adult conversation with the intense focus of someone whose life depended on understanding every word. Her son caught her eye and nodded slightly. Not the blind trust of a child, but the considered judgment of someone who'd already seen too much of the world's cruelty. "What did you have in mind?" she asked. The plan that emerged was audacious and dangerous. a coordinated strike against Hartwell's network designed to expose the conspiracy and eliminate its key players. Burning Wolf's warriors would hit the outlying ranches where Hartwell's enforcers were based, while Tamaqua led a small force against the man's headquarters in Denver. Ada's role was the most dangerous of all. She would surrender herself to federal marshals in the town of Cedar Ridge, carrying evidence of the conspiracy, but allowing herself to be taken into custody. The theory was that Hartwell would want to interrogate her personally, giving them a chance to get close to him. "And if he just orders me shot on sight?" Ada asked. "Then we avenge you and raise your son as warrior." Burning Wolf replied matter-of-factly. It wasn't much of a comfort, but Ada had accepted that comfort was a luxury she could no longer afford. The alternative, running until they were caught or died of exposure, offered even worse odds for Eli's survival. "When do we start?" "Tomorrow. Strike must be swift, all targets hit simultaneously." Burning Wolf rolled up the maps. "Tonight we rest. Tomorrow we see if justice is stronger than greed." Ada spent the night holding Eli close, memorizing the sound of his breathing and the warmth of his small body pressed against hers. Tomorrow might be the last day they spent together, and she wanted to carry the memory of this peaceful moment into whatever darkness awaited. Just before dawn, Tamaqua woke her with gentle touch on her shoulder. "Time to go," he said quietly. Ada kissed Eli's forehead and whispered a prayer she'd learned from her own mother, not to God, but to the fierce, protective spirit that lived in every woman's heart when her children were threatened. Then she rose to meet whatever fate awaited them all. Cedar Ridge squatted on the prairie like a diseased growth, its unpainted buildings gray with age and neglect. Ada rode into town alone, hands visible, and empty Reeves's satchel of evidence tied to her saddle horn. The few people on the street gave her suspicious looks, but didn't interfere. A lone woman posed no obvious threat. The federal marshal's office occupied a corner building near the center of town, its windows barred and its door reinforced with iron strips. Ada tied her horse to the hitching post and walked inside her heart, hammering so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. Two marshals looked up from their desks as she entered, one young and nervous, the other middle-aged, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Both wore the slightly rumpled look of men who'd been expecting trouble. "Help you, ma'am?" The older marshal asked, his hand moving casually toward his gun belt. "I'm Ada Carrick. I believe you have warrants for my arrest." The young marshal nearly fell out of his chair, reaching for his weapon. The older man moved more slowly, but with deadly purpose. "Well, I'll be damned. The murdering widow herself." He stood slowly, his pistol now clear of its holster. "You picked a strange way to turn yourself in, lady. I have information about Colonel Hartwell's activities. Information he'll want to hear." Ada gestured toward the satchel. Evidence of conspiracy, murder, land fraud, worth a lot more than any bounty. The marshals exchanged glances. Clearly Hartwell's name carried weight even here. "Search her, Billy," the older man ordered. "Check for weapons, then lock her up. I'll wire the colonel that we've got his problem child." The search was thorough and humiliating, but Ada endured it without protest. They confiscated the satchel and locked her in a windowless cell that reeked of unwashed bodies and despair. Hours passed in darkness, broken only by the occasional footstep or muffled conversation from the outer office. Gunfire erupted somewhere in the distance, rapid professional volleys followed by scattered single shots. Ada pressed her ear to the cell wall, trying to gauge the direction and intensity of the battle. It sounded like it was coming from the north end of town, where Burning Wolf's scouts had reported seeing a concentration of armed men. The shooting continued for nearly an hour before fading to occasional sniper fire. Ada had no way of knowing which side was winning, but the very fact that fighting continued suggested Hartwell's people hadn't achieved easy victory. Footsteps approached her cell. Not the heavy boots of the local marshals, but the lighter tread of someone moving with military precision. A key turned in the lock, and the door swung open, revealing a man Ada recognized from newspaper illustrations. Colonel Marcus Hartwell was smaller than she'd expected, with thinning hair and pale eyes that held no warmth whatsoever. He wore a perfectly tailored uniform, despite holding no active military commission, and his soft hands suggested a life spent well away from physical labor. "Mrs. Carrick," he said pleasantly, settling into a chair one of the marshals had brought. "You've caused me considerable inconvenience." "Good," Ada replied. Hartwell smiled. "I appreciate directness. It saves us both time." He opened the satchel and spread its contents across a small table. "Interesting reading. Some of these letters are quite incriminating, enough to hang you for murder and conspiracy. In a court of law, perhaps. But we're not in a courtroom, are we?" Hartwell selected one of the letters and held it up to the cell's single lantern. "Paper burns so easily. Without evidence, you're just a delusional widow making wild accusations." Ada watched him burn letter after letter, each one representing hours of careful documentation, but she felt no despair. This had always been a possibility they'd planned for. "Those are copies," she said calmly. "The originals are safely hidden, along with additional evidence you don't know about." Hartwell's smile faltered slightly. "What additional evidence?" "Medical examination of my husband's body. Traces of arsenic in his hair and fingernails. Testimony from the doctor who treated him describing symptoms consistent with slow poisoning. It was a bluff. Thomas had been buried months ago, and Ada had no idea if such evidence could still be obtained. But Hartwell's reaction told her the accusation had hit home. Interesting theory, difficult to prove, not when combined with records of arsenic purchases by your associates. Bank records showing payments to known assassins. Sworn statements from settlers who survived attacks by men wearing army uniforms but carrying no proper identification. Another bluff, but Hartwell was looking distinctly uncomfortable now. Outside, the gunfire had stopped entirely. Either the battle was over or the combatants had withdrawn to regroup. Even if such evidence existed, Hartwell said carefully, "It would die with you, along with your son." "My son isn't here." "No, but he's close. My men are very good at tracking fugitives." Hartwell stood and brushed ash from his uniform. "In fact, they should be returning with him shortly." Terror clawed at Ada's chest, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "Then you'll have what you want. No need for more killing." "Oh, but there is. You see, Mrs. Carrick, this was never just about land or money. It was about power, the power to reshape an entire territory according to my vision." Hartwell's pale eyes glittered with fanatic intensity. "Your resistance, however futile, has inspired others. Settlers are asking questions, demanding investigations. That cannot be allowed to continue." The cell door clanged shut again, leaving Ada alone with the knowledge that she'd failed. Hartwell was right. Even if Burning Wolf's warriors had struck successful blows against his network, the man himself remained untouchable, protected by corrupt law and unlimited resources. But then she heard something that made her heart leap with desperate hope. Eli's voice, young but steady, echoing from somewhere nearby. "You want me, mister? Come and get me." The explosion that followed shook the entire building, raining dust and debris from the ceiling. Ada was thrown against the cell wall as windows shattered and men shouted in panic from the outer office. Through the chaos, she could hear the distinctive war cries of Comanche warriors mixing with the screams of terrified townspeople. Smoke poured under the cell door, acrid and choking. Ada pressed her face to the floor, trying to find breathable air while the sounds of battle raged outside. Gunshots wore whoops, the splintering of wood as doors were kicked in and furniture overturned. The cell door burst open, and Tamaqua appeared through the smoke, his face streaked with war paint and blood. "Can you walk?" "Yes. Where's Eli?" "Safe, come." They fought their way through the burning marshal's office, stepping over bodies and debris. Outside, Cedar Ridge was in chaos, buildings blazing, people running in panic. Burning Wolf's warriors moving through the streets with deadly efficiency. But Ada saw no sign of random slaughter or scalp taking. The Comanche were targeting specific buildings and individuals, not conducting a general massacre. Tamaqua led her to an alley, where Eli waited with two of Burning Wolf's men, his face smudged with soot, but his eyes bright with fierce satisfaction. "Did you see the explosion, Mama? I made it with gunpowder and nails just like Tamaqua taught me." Ada grabbed her son and held him tight, relief washing over her in waves. "You could have been killed, but I wasn't. And now the bad men can't hurt anyone else." Over Eli's head, Ada met Tamaqua's eyes. "Hartwell escaped in the confusion, but his records are destroyed, his men scattered or dead." Tamaqua's expression was grim. "War is not over, but this battle is won." Burning Wolf emerged from the smoke, his war paint making him look like an avatar of vengeance. "Time to go. Soldiers will come soon." They rode out of Cedar Ridge as the town burned behind them, the flames visible for miles across the darkening prairie. Ada felt no sympathy for the destruction. Too many innocent people had died to protect Hartwell's conspiracy. If it took fire and blood to expose the truth, so be it. But she knew Tamaqua was right. The war wasn't over. Hartwell would regroup, find new allies, devise new schemes. Men like him didn't surrender easily. "Where do we go now?" she asked as they rode through the night. "North," Burning Wolf replied. "To winter camp in the mountains. You and Boy will be safe there." "For how long?" "Until spring. Then we finish what we started." Ada looked at Eli, who rode beside her with the easy confidence of someone born to the saddle. In the span of a few months, her gentle Boy had learned to track, hunt, fight, and make explosives. The child who'd once feared his uncle's shadow now faced armed enemies with steady nerves and fierce determination. She should have been horrified by the transformation. Instead, she felt pride and a strange sense of completion. This was what survival looked like on the frontier, not the soft compliance she'd been taught as a woman, but the hard wisdom that came from facing the worst of human nature and refusing to break, refusing. Behind them, Cedar Ridge continued to burn its flames, a beacon of defiance against those who would prey on the weak and defenseless. Ahead lay the unknown wilderness of the Colorado mountains, where winter would test them with cold and hunger and the constant threat of discovery. But Ada was no longer afraid. She had found her strength in the crucible of violence and betrayal, forged bonds stronger than blood, with people her former world would have called enemies. Whatever came next, they would face it together, not as victims fleeing from injustice, but as warriors carrying the fight directly to their enemies. The old Ada Carrick, the quiet widow who believed in the protection of law and the kindness of family, was gone forever. In her place rode someone harder and more dangerous, a woman who had killed to protect her child, and would kill again without hesitation. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like coming home. The winter camp lay hidden in a box canyon, high in the Colorado Rockies, accessible only by a treacherous trail that wound through snow-covered peaks and ice-slicked ledges. Burning Wolf's people had used this refuge for generations, its natural defenses supplemented by carefully placed rock slides that could seal the entrance at a moment's notice. Ada and Eli spent the cold months learning the ways of the Comanche, how to read weather signs and cloud formations, how to preserve meat by smoking it over carefully tended fires, how to make weapons from bone and sinew when metal was scarce. But more importantly, they learned the bonds of chosen family, the fierce loyalty that bound people together when blood ties proved insufficient. Spring came late that year with snow lingering in the high passes well into May. When the trails finally cleared, riders began arriving at the winter camp, not Comanche warriors, but white settlers carrying news from the outside world. The first messenger was a grizzled homesteader named Jeremiah Walsh, his clothes patched and his horse showing the effects of hard travel. He brought newspapers from Denver and Colorado Springs, their headlines telling a story that made Ada's heart race with hope and terror in equal measure. Territorial administrator accused of conspiracy. Read the Denver Post. Federal investigation launched into land fraud allegations. The Colorado Springs Gazette went further. Multiple witnesses come forward in Hartwell scandal. Calls for congressional hearing mount. It's working. Ada breathed, scanning the articles. People are listening. Some people, Walsh corrected grimly. But Hartwell's got friends in high places. Federal marshals are still hunting you, and there's talk of bringing in the cavalry to pacify hostile Indians in this region. More messengers arrived over the following weeks, each bringing pieces of a larger puzzle. Settlers throughout the territory were organizing demanding investigations into suspicious deaths and forced land sales. Several of Hartwell's key associates had been arrested, though the man himself remained untouchable behind a wall of legal protection and political influence. But the most significant news came from an unexpected source, a well-dressed woman in her 50s, who arrived at the canyon entrance under a flag of truce, identifying herself as Margaret Hartwell, the colonel's estranged wife. "I've come to offer you information," she told Ada during a tense meeting in Burning Wolf's lodge. "Information that could destroy my husband completely." "Why would you betray your own husband?" Ada asked. Margaret Hartwell's smile was bitter as winter wind. "Because he murdered our son." The story that emerged was one of corruption within corruption, betrayal within betrayal. Margaret's son Robert had been a federal attorney investigating irregularities in territorial land grants. When he'd gotten too close to the truth about his father's activities, he'd died in what was officially ruled a hunting accident. Marcus thought I believed his lies about Robert's death. Margaret continued. "But a mother knows. A mother always knows." She produced a leather portfolio filled with documents, bank records, correspondence contracts that laid out the full scope of Hartwell's conspiracy. Unlike the copies they'd lost in Cedar Ridge, these were originals signed and witnessed impossible to dismiss as forgeries. "This is enough to hang him 10 times over," Tamaqua observed, studying the papers by firelight. "If it reaches the right people," Margaret replied. "Marcus has judges and politicians in his pocket throughout the territory. But there are still honest men in Washington, senators and congressmen who knew Robert, who respected his work." "And how do we get these documents to Washington without Hartwell's people intercepting them?" Ada asked. Margaret's smile grew sharp as a blade. "We don't send them. We take them. In person, with witnesses who can't be silenced or bought." The plan that emerged was audacious, even by Burning Wolf standards. Instead of hiding in the mountains or conducting guerrilla raids, they would travel to Washington, D.C. itself, Ada, Eli, Margaret Hartwell, and a small escort of Comanche warriors. They would present their evidence directly to Congress, forcing a public hearing that Hartwell couldn't suppress or manipulate. "It's madness," Ada said. "We'd have to cross 1,000 miles of hostile territory, evade federal marshals and bounty hunters, somehow gain access to senators and congressmen who have no reason to trust us." "Yes," Burning Wolf agreed. "But it is madness that might work, and all other paths lead to slow death in these mountains." Ada looked at Eli, who had been listening to the adult conversation with the same intense focus he'd shown throughout their ordeal. Her son was 11 now, tall for his age and lean with the kind of muscle that came from hard living. His eyes held knowledge no child should possess, but also a strength that made her proud. "What do you think, honey?" she asked. Eli was quiet for a long moment, weighing options with the careful deliberation of someone who'd learned that words had consequences. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the certainty of absolute conviction. "I think we should do it. I think Papa would want us to do it." Ada felt tears sting her eyes at the mention of Thomas. Her gentle husband would indeed have wanted justice for all the families Hartwell had destroyed, even if it meant risking their own lives to achieve it. "Then it's decided," she said quietly. "We go to Washington." The journey east took 6 weeks, following routes known only to mountain men and Indian guides. They traveled mostly at night, avoiding settlements and military posts, living off game and wild plants, supplemented by supplies cached at friendly trading posts. Ada marveled at how efficiently their small group moved through country that would have been impossible for conventional travelers. Tamaqua proved to be an expert at forging documents, creating papers that identified their party as Margaret Hartwell's household staff traveling to visit relatives in the East. The disguise was thin, but serviceable. Few officials bothered to examine servants too closely, especially when those servants were accompanied by a respectable white woman with proper credentials. They encountered danger only twice during the journey. The first time they were stopped by a patrol of territorial marshals near the Kansas border. Ada held her breath as the officers questioned Margaret Hartwell. But the woman's performance was flawless. She played the part of a grieving widow, returning to her family home with such conviction that the marshals offered their condolences and wished her safe travels. The second incident came near St. Louis, where bounty hunters had apparently received word of their passage. The attack came at dawn as they watered their horses at a stream, bullets whining through the morning mist without warning. But these weren't the professional killers they'd faced in Colorado. These were opportunists and drifters drawn by the promise of easy money, unprepared for the coordinated resistance they encountered. Burning Wolf's warriors struck back with silent efficiency, arrows finding targets before the attackers could reload their rifles. When the shooting stopped, 5 bounty hunters lay dead beside the stream. Eli stood over one of the bodies, a captured rifle in his hands, his face showing neither satisfaction nor remorse, just the cold practicality of someone who'd learned to kill in order to survive. "You did well," Tamaqua told him quietly. "I did what was necessary." Eli replied, his voice steady despite his youth. Ada watched her son clean the rifle with practiced efficiency and wondered what kind of man he would become. The frontier had stolen his childhood, but given him strength and purpose in return. Whether that was a fair trade remained to be seen. Washington, D.C., in the summer of 1874, was a city of contrasts, magnificent government buildings rising beside squalid tenements, elegant carriages sharing muddy streets with garbage wagons and livestock. The smell of coal smoke and human waste competed with the scent of flowers from carefully tended parks where the wealthy took their leisure. Margaret Hartwell's family connections proved invaluable in navigating the political maze of the capital. Her late father had been a congressman from Pennsylvania, and several of his former colleagues were still active in the House and Senate. More importantly, her son Robert had made friends among reform-minded politicians who remembered him as an honest man in a corrupt profession. But even with connections and irrefutable evidence, the process of bringing Hartwell to justice proved frustratingly slow. Senators had to be convinced, hearing scheduled witnesses protected from intimidation or worse. All while Hartwell's allies in Washington worked to discredit their accusations and delay any official action. "He knows we're here," Margaret reported after a meeting with Senator Morrison of Illinois. "Marcus has friends in the Justice Department who keep him informed of developments." "Then we're in danger," Ada said. "More danger. We've been in danger since the moment we decided to oppose him." Margaret's face was haggard from weeks of political maneuvering. "But Morrison believes us. He's calling for a formal congressional investigation with full subpoena power." The attack came 3 days later, just as Ada was beginning to hope they might succeed without further bloodshed. Professional assassins struck their boarding house near midnight, moving with military precision and overwhelming firepower. But Burning Wolf's warriors had been expecting such an attack. The Comanche had positioned themselves throughout the building and surrounding area, turning the boarding house into a fortress without the other residents' knowledge. When the assassins struck, they found themselves facing an enemy that fought by rules they didn't understand. The battle was brief but vicious. Ada huddled in an upstairs room with Eli and Margaret, listening to gunshots and war cries echoing through the corridors below. By dawn, 7 would-be killers lay dead in the street, and Washington's newspapers were full of lurid accounts about savage Indians battling mysterious gunmen in the heart of the nation's capital. The publicity, while sensational, actually helped their cause. Senator Morrison used the attack as evidence that powerful forces were trying to suppress the truth about territorial corruption. Within a week, he'd secured authorization for full congressional hearings with federal marshals assigned to protect the witnesses. Ada testified for 3 hours before a packed hearing room describing Roy Whitmore's abuse, Thomas's suspicious death, and the conspiracy of violence and fraud that had destroyed dozens of families. Her words were recorded by stenographers and reprinted in newspapers across the country, making her story impossible for Hartwell's allies to suppress or discredit. Margaret Hartwell followed with even more damaging testimony, presenting documents that proved her husband's involvement in murders, land fraud, and conspiracy to incite Indian wars for personal profit. Her accusation that he'd killed their own son to protect his criminal enterprise sent shockwaves through the hearing room. But the most powerful moment came when Eli took the witness stand. The boy, for he was still just a boy despite everything he'd endured, spoke in a clear, steady voice about what Roy Whitmore had tried to do to him, about the violence he'd witnessed, about the need for justice. Not just for his family, but for all the other families who'd been destroyed by Hartwell's greed. My papa always said that good people have to stand up to bad people even when it's dangerous. Eli testified. He died because he believed that. But his death wasn't wasted if it helped stop other good people from being hurt. There wasn't a dry eye in the hearing room when he finished speaking. The congressional investigation took another month to complete, but its conclusions were devastating for Hartwell and his associates. Federal indictments were issued for dozens of territorial officials, ranging from local sheriffs to the territorial governor himself. Military officers who'd participated in fake Indian raids were court-martialed and stripped of rank. Hartwell himself fled to Mexico before he could be arrested, but his empire of corruption collapsed overnight. The railroad companies that had financed his operations faced massive lawsuits and congressional oversight. Most importantly, the territorial government was reorganized under federal supervision with new officials committed to honest administration. Ada, Eli, and their Comanche allies were granted full pardons for any crimes committed during their fight against Hartwell's conspiracy. More than that, they were hailed as heroes by reform newspapers and citizen groups throughout the West. But Ada took little satisfaction in their victory. Too many good people had died, too much suffering had been endured for her to feel triumphant. Justice had been served, but at a cost that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The small cabin Ada built on the Oregon coast bore little resemblance to the Colorado homestead where her journey had begun. This new home was larger and sturdier, constructed with the help of neighbors who respected her for what she'd endured, rather than pitying her for what she'd lost. The surrounding community was made up largely of other survivors, veterans of Indian wars, widows of failed miners, homesteaders who'd been driven from their land by forces beyond their control. Eli, now 12 and growing tall like his father, spent his days learning the trades of fishing and farming, alongside the skills of tracking and hunting that Tamaqua had taught him. He was a serious boy, shown beyond his years, but not bitter, carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd faced the worst the world could offer and survived. Tamaqua had chosen to stay with them rather than return to the diminished life of reservation or hiding. Ada wasn't sure what to call their relationship. They weren't married, but they were far more than friends. He was teacher, protector, partner, and something else that didn't have a name in either English or Comanche. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked him one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the Pacific in shades of gold and crimson. "Giving up your old life to help us?" Tamaqua was quiet for a long moment, whittling a piece of driftwood with the same careful precision he brought to everything. Old life was already gone. Wife dead, daughter lost, people scattered. What I found with you and Eli, this is not old life. This is new life. Ada understood. Her own old life, the quiet widow who believed in the protection of law and the kindness of family, had died in Roy Whitmore's house that terrible night. What had emerged from that death was someone harder and more capable, forged by necessity, and tempered by loss. The transformation hadn't been without cost. She still woke sometimes from nightmares about the people she'd killed, the violence she'd witnessed, the constant fear that had shaped their flight across half the continent. But she'd learned to carry those memories without being crushed by them, to honor the dead without being haunted by their ghosts. Eli came up from the beach, carrying a string of fish, his movements showing the easy confidence of someone equally at home on land or water. At 12, he already showed signs of becoming a formidable man, not large, but quick and intelligent, with the kind of quiet strength that didn't need to prove itself through violence. "My boats are coming in," he reported, settling onto the porch steps. "Mr. Johnson says there's talk of trouble up north. Timber companies trying to force out the Indian families." Ada felt her chest tighten. After everything they'd been through, the thought of other families facing similar persecution was almost unbearable. "Not our fight," Tamaqua said quietly, but Ada could see the conflict in his eyes. "Isn't it?" Eli asked. "Papa always said good people have to stand up to bad people." The echo of Thomas's words, spoken in Eli's young voice, sent a chill through Ada. She'd thought their fighting days were over, that they'd earned the right to live quietly and let others carry the burden of justice. But she realized now that such luxury was an illusion. As long as powerful men preyed on the weak, as long as corruption masqueraded as law and greed disguised itself as progress, there would always be another fight. The only choice was whether to meet that fight head-on or wait for it to come to them. "We'll help them," she said finally. "Not because we have to, but because we can." Tamaqua nodded slowly, understanding passing between them without need for words. They'd built a good life here on the Oregon coast, but it was a life defined by more than personal happiness. It was a life committed to the principle that justice was worth fighting for, even when that fight came at great personal cost. That night, as Ada tucked Eli into bed, he asked the question she'd been dreading. "Mama, do you think we'll ever be able to stop fighting?" Ada considered lying, offering him the comfortable fiction that their troubles were behind them, but Eli deserved the truth, even if it was harder to bear. "I don't know, honey. Maybe someday the world will be different. Maybe someday good people won't have to fight bad people to protect their families." She smoothed his hair so like his father's. "But until that day comes, we do what we have to do. Because it's right. Because it's right. And because your papa would expect nothing less from us." Eli nodded, satisfied with that answer. He'd grown up in a world where right and wrong weren't abstract concepts, but life and death realities. The knowledge that good required active defense didn't frighten him. It simply shaped how he viewed his responsibilities as a man growing up on the frontier. Ada stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her son sleep. Tomorrow they would begin planning another campaign, gathering intelligence and allies for another fight against forces that seemed as endless as they were corrupt. The work would be dangerous, the outcome uncertain, the cost potentially devastating. But for the first time since that terrible night in Colorado, Ada felt something she'd almost forgotten: hope. Not the naive hope of her younger self, who'd believed that goodness would be rewarded and evil punished by natural law. This was a harder hope, tempered by experience and strengthened by the knowledge that justice was something that had to be fought for generation after generation. She'd lost her first family to violence and betrayal. But she'd gained something in return, a chosen family bound together, not by blood, but by shared purpose. A commitment to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was the life she'd been called to live. Outside, waves crashed against the rocky shore with rhythmic persistence, wearing away at stone with patient determination. Ada smiled at the metaphor. Like the ocean, they would continue their work of justice quietly and persistently, knowing that even the hardest obstacles could be overcome by those willing to keep fighting. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggles, but somehow comforting in their constancy. Whatever tomorrow brought, They would face it together, not as victims fleeing from injustice, but as warriors carrying the light of truth into whatever darkness awaited. Some fights were worth everything. This was one of them. Thus ends the tale of Ada Carrick, who discovered that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from avoiding violence, but from knowing when such violence serves justice rather than vengeance. In the unforgiving wilderness of the American frontier, she learned that family is not defined by blood, but by the willingness to sacrifice everything for those we love. And in the crucible of corruption and betrayal, she found that true victory lies not in the defeat of individual enemies, but in the preservation of hope for future generations who will carry on the fight for justice in their own time and their own way.